Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. Last week, the 57-year-old Delhi University professor G.N. Sai Baba passed away in a Hyderabad hospital where he was undergoing treatment for gallbladder stones. For those of you who don't already know, Sai Baba had been accused of having Maoist links and had spent nearly a decade in jail because of it. However, 7 months ago, the Bombay High Court cleared him of all charges. And what's worth noting is that this was actually the second time that the court was acquitting him in the case. The first was back in October 2022, after which the state had immediately appealed the ruling, leading him to remain in prison for another 17 months. Now, the other thing you need to know about Sai Baba was that he had a 90% disability due to a polio infection he contracted during childhood. The disease left him paralyzed from the waist down. When he was released from the Nagpur jail back in March, he had spoken about the health complications he faced while he was in jail. And during his incarceration, Sai Baba's family and lawyers had repeatedly raised concerns and filed applications in court about his worsening health condition and the delays in treatment. In fact, those close to him now describe his death as an institutional murder. So in this episode, we are taking a look at Sai Baba's case from the beginning to understand the failings of both the state and the judiciary. We begin by speaking with the Indian Express's Vidisha Kuntamala, who has been reporting on the case for the paper. Vidisha, before we talk about his case, could you tell us a bit more about who G.N. Sai Baba was?
So G.N. Sai Baba was a former assistant professor in Ramlal Anand College at Delhi University. For those who don't know, is a college under DU in the South Campus. And he is also known for contributing most of his life's work towards human rights activism. He's raised his voice for the Dalit and the Adivasis, and mostly it was during the Operation Green Hunt where he was sort of raising his voice for the rights of these Adivasis, for their rights on the tribal land that they were living.
Right, and for those who may not remember, Operation Green Hunt was this massive operation carried out by paramilitary forces in Chhattisgarh back in 2009. Thousands of CRPF personnel had moved into the state back then, and this is the period when hundreds of Naxalites, villagers, and even security forces were killed in the operations. But, when we talk about Sai Baba, people across the country came to know about him after he was arrested in 2014. Talk about what actually led to his arrest.
So in 2013, on September 12th, a team of Maharashtra police raided Sai Baba's residence in Delhi University. Back then, he was still an assistant professor at Ramlal Anand College, and the university had provided him with an accommodation. So the police arrested him on May 9th, 2014, claiming that he was an active member of the banned organization, the Communist Party of India, Maoist. And 5 others were also arrested. And the police claimed that they were all CPIM members who hatched a criminal conspiracy to wage war against the government of India through unlawful activities and by use of violence. So the police also alleged that Sai Baba was found to possess documents and electronic gadgets containing Maoist literature, correspondence between members, and video clips of their meetings.
Yeah, and just the Maoist literature and documents that he was allegedly possessing were some of the key evidence, according to the state, that he was waging a war against the government of India. And he was actually not the only accused in the case, right? There were 4 others. So talk about who they were and how Sai Baba was said to be connected to them.
So Sai Baba was accused of arranging a meeting of the other accused, who's the former student of JNU, Hem Mishra, and an Uttarakhand-based journalist, Prashant Rahi, with members of the banned CPIM and its alleged frontal organization, the Revolutionary Democratic Front. So 3 years later, in 2017, the Gadchiroli court convicted Sai Baba along with Mahesh Tirki, Hem Mishra, Pandu Narote, Prashant Rahi, and Vijay Tirki. All of them were sentenced to life imprisonment except for Tirki, who got 10 years in jail.
Right, and I think at this point we should talk a bit about his health. Can you tell us the problems he suffered after he got arrested in 2014?
So he has been 90% disabled waist down due to a polio infection, which he got infected by at the age of 50. So he was 90% disabled, paralyzed from waist down during the time that he was arrested. When we spoke to him after his acquittal, he had mentioned that he had an injury to the brachial plexus, a network of nerves that carry signals from the spinal cord to the arms and hands, and his left arm had become immobile. And he said this, mentioning that when he was being taken to the police station in Aheri, the constables couldn't handle the wheelchair properly and the wheelchair broke. While there was no intention to hurt him, they just dragged him by his arm and he fell off the wheelchair. So the following 9 months, he was in a lot of pain while he was in the prison. And his wife, Vasanta, had to put in a lot of petitions to the National Human Rights Commission and other rights groups. And then that's when Sai Baba was admitted to a government medical college in Nagpur, which recommended a nerve grafting procedure. So when he came back to Delhi and got admitted to AIIMS, he was told by the doctors that it was too late to get the procedure done to fix his left arm. So meanwhile, he also suffered other complications like the curvature of the spine to a side and the thickening of the heart muscle and pancreatitis and inflammation of the pancreas that made it difficult for him to digest food. So all of this took a huge toll on him physically and also on his family while he was doing time in prison.
So this started around 2015 and went on until after he was acquitted.
Yeah. After his death, the family even today claims that, his health got deteriorated so much in prison, and despite repeated requests and pointing out that this condition of him is getting worse and it might be fatal, no proper care was given to him while he was in prison, which is why they believe that he couldn't even survive a simple surgery to remove gallbladder stones.
And you mentioned that he was convicted in 2017. Now he later challenged this conviction and was first acquitted in October 2022 by the Bombay High Court. Could you talk about what led to this?
So on March 7, 2017, Sai Baba and 5 others were found guilty by the Sessions Court under various charges, including the UAPA, which is the anti-terror law, and he was sentenced to life imprisonment. The court said that though the wheelchair-bound Sai Baba was disabled, there was no ground to show him leniency as he was mentally fit, and called him a high-profile leader of the CPIM. So his lawyers argued that the entire trial was vitiated as the mandatory sanction necessary to prosecute an accused under UAPA was only granted after trial began. But the court did not consider this valid, and an appeal was then filed before the Bombay High Court. So in 2022, Sai Baba got his first acquittal and his co-accused were cleared of all charges by the Nagpur bench of the Bombay High Court.
And tell us what the court had observed while acquitting him in this case.
So I'm just quoting what the Bombay High Court had noted. So the court had noted various faults in the procedure followed by the investigating agency concerning the grant of sanction under UAPA. It held that the proceedings before the trial court were null and void as there was no valid sanction.
Right, and because we are talking about this sanction, we should explain that in UAPA cases and even sedition cases, for example, a competent authority must give a sanction before a court accepts the charges. And so in this case, what the High Court observed was that the sanction was granted a day after the court had framed the charges. But tell us what happened after the court acquitted Sai Baba on this basis. What exactly did the state do?
So after the High Court order was pronounced in October in 2022, the Maharashtra government immediately moved an urgent appeal before the Supreme Court on the same day. It happened on October 14th, and by evening, the Maharashtra government immediately moved to an urgent appeal to the Supreme Court, mentioned by the Solicitor General of India. So by then, family members of those cleared of the charges, including Sai Baba, had begun with the release formalities at Nagpur jail. But a bench comprising Justice M.R. Shah and Justice Bela Trivedi suspended the High Court order, stating that the decision to clear the accused on the grounds of invalid sanction needed to be considered in detail. So his bail was sort of stopped by the Supreme Court, saying that they had to reconsider the grounds on which these allegations were invalid. And then Sai Baba's lawyers argued that even as the court suspended the order, it could have granted him bail pending proceedings, considering his medical condition. However, the court even refused that. Then 6 months later, in April 2023, the Supreme Court sent back the case to the High Court.
Right, and we should also mention that during his time in prison, Sai Baba was kept in the Anda cell, which is the most isolated part of the prison meant for high-risk prisoners. Inmates in the Anda cell cannot interact with other prisoners, visit the library or the canteen, or have access to the main courtyard. And it's called the Anda cell because it's shaped like an egg, mainly because it provides a better view for the authorities to monitor and patrol the inmates. So this is where Sai Baba is after the court's ruling. Tell us what happens after the Supreme Court sends the case back to the High Court in April 2023.
So after that, then a year later, the High Court acquitted Sai Baba and others on March 5th in 2024, observing that holding a trial under UAPA without adhering to procedural requirements would amount to a failure to justice. While holding the sanction as invalid, the court said that the independent authority, the Directorate of Prosecution, had only given a half-page communication to justify the recommendation to grant sanction. On Sai Baba, it said, I'm quoting the court here, in sum and substance, the prosecution against accused number 6, GN Sai Baba, for want of valid sanction is also totally vitiated. So the court also questioned the credibility of his house being searched. It noted that the police chose an illiterate person to be an independent punch, a witness mandated to be present during search procedures. Though many highly educated witnesses would have been available, his residence being on university campus, further, the police had not proven any conspiracy to commit a terrorist act. And then he was released.
And do you recall how the family had reacted after he was finally released from jail?
So what really struck me in this entire story was he couldn't have done it without Vasanta. Like, his wife is the glue for this entire fight. Like, she was the one who was taking care of his daughter. So we spoke to Vasanta and they never lost hope. Like, even Sai Baba in prison, like recently I was speaking to Hem Mishra when Sai Baba passed away. And Hem Mishra had shared the same cell in the Anda cell with Sai Baba. So Anda cell is basically only for one person, but because Sai Baba was disabled and he needed help, the same cell had like 2 other people to help him, and Hem Mishra was one of them. And even Sai Baba himself, he never really lost any hope. Like, even when we met him, he truly believed that he did not commit any crime. And even Vasanta, like when he got acquitted, the first reaction was that, we always knew that truth would prevail. And, we always believed in the judiciary that justice will be served. So that was the first reaction.
Also, after he was first arrested, he lost his teaching job at the Delhi University. Was he able to get that job back after he got out?
No. So after he came out, he was legally pursuing to get his job back from DU. So when he lost his job in 2014, after his arrest, he lost his job. The DUTA, the Delhi University Teachers Association back then, and all these teacher activists like Nandita Narain, they all protested against this move of Delhi University. But unfortunately, he lost it. I mean, he was served his termination orders. He was served a show cause notice when he got arrested. But he couldn't respond back because he was in prison. So after he came out, he had also mentioned that he was legally pursuing to get his job back in Delhi University. And he really wanted to get back to teaching because he was an excellent teacher and that was his passion, to be a good teacher. But unfortunately, before that could happen, before the court could give its say in it, he passed away.
And how did people who were close to him react to his death? Because it had only been 7 months since he was released from jail.
So what is really heartbreaking about this entire story is that he was barely back home like 7 months ago. Like, even though 7 months, this is what Vasanta in her words told me, is that, these 7 months, like, I couldn't see him enough. I couldn't even talk to him enough because we didn't have much time. because every day they had to just go to the hospital because his health was too bad. As soon as he got released, the first thing they did, like even when he was in prison, when I used to call her for a study, the first thing she'd say that I want him to come back home so that I can take him to AIIMS and just admit him over there first. So that's what they did after he got released. They admitted him first to AIIMS. We met him for the first time in AIIMS. And so basically that's what she said, that, there was not enough time. And like, this was such a beautiful love story because both of them, they fell in love when they were 15 years old. They're childhood sweethearts. They spent their entire life together. They brought a child up, and they shared the same ideologies and the same passion. And it was just a beautiful love story. And Sai Baba's arrest was the first time that she sort of had to stay away from him for a long time. But now they were always together. So she just said that, like the first words when I spoke to her over the phone was, there's no Vasanta without Sai. And so she said that he might not be there physically, but, he'll always be in my thoughts and in my heart.
And he's also survived by his 26-year-old daughter, Manjari. What are some of the things that she told you?
So when Manjira spoke to us, she said that, he missed the most formative years of her growing up. And she thought that finally her father was back and he would stay with her for a lifetime. But unfortunately, it was just very sudden and shocking for them that the daughter couldn't spend enough time. And I just want to mention this. So when I was talking to Vasanta earlier, after his acquittal, she had mentioned about a letter that Sai Baba had written to her from prison, in which he has written, I can't quote the exact thing because I don't know the exact lines, but it was along the lines that if I'm still in prison and I do not come back home, I might end up being another Stan Swami. That's what he had written in one of his letters. So in Stan Swami's case, he had passed away in 2021 and he was 84 years old. He was a tribal activist, marked the lowest point in the judicial process of the Bhima Koregaon case. And he was denied bail under medical grounds several times. And he just died on July 5th, 2021, the day his bail hearing was scheduled. So just like in Stan Swami's case, despite asking for bail under medical conditions and pointing out that this deteriorating health condition could lead to his death, and despite appealing for it multiple times, the issue not being taken seriously by the prison administration and by the court has what is being believed to have led to him becoming very weak at the end. So when I was talking to Hem Mishra and even Vasanta for that instance, Hem Mishra, I'm quoting him, he just said that this was not a natural death. This was an institutional murder is what he said. And even Vasanta for that instance, after Sai Baba passed away, she said that he was not taken care of properly in prison, which is why he couldn't survive a simple surgery.
Now, it's not just Stan Swami. There are also other similarities between G and Sai Baba's case and a series of UAPA cases we have seen in recent years, including the one against Umar Khalid.
So, at the heart of all of these cases is this question about who is a terrorist and how much leeway does the state get in determining that question, right? That's the essence of it.
That's Indian Express's legal editor, Apurva Vishwanath.
Well, the state makes a preliminary determination, which is why they are arrested. In the case of G and Sai Baba, the question was that he was an active member of the Communist Party of India Maoist and he was arrested. The proof or the evidence that was sort of put forth before the court is that there was some Maoist literature, correspondence with members and some such thing. So this is also a very seminal question that the courts still have to decide in a larger context about: is mere association with an unlawful organization without any active wrongdoing enough? But in this case, we are not even talking about a direct link or like an association. We're talking about whether having certain literature can be considered association. So, there are revolutionary poets whose literature you can very easily categorize as so-called anti-national literature. So these are fundamental questions. And I think all of these cases have in the last sort of decade put the spotlight on how the state has a very, very low threshold to determine this. Of course, then the issue goes to court. And we've seen in a bunch of cases, the court may ultimately give you relief. or determine that the government's threshold, the state's threshold is not good enough, that the bar needs to be higher, like it did in the case of Sai Baba, right? Twice the Bombay High Court acquitted him. But that comes after a significant lag. And we are so used to this long wait for justice that we don't even bat an eyelid anymore. People's lives are completely destroyed in this process. We saw Sudha Bharadwaj. We saw Umar Khalid, for example, is in his 5th year in jail. And this is a young man who has a whole life ahead of himself and in his prime years are in prison. Or in the case of, say, Sai Baba, when he went to jail, he was in his mid-40s. And these are all, years that are just spent where you don't get them back, of course.
Now, in such cases, the judiciary is, of course, the last resort, the ultimate guardian. However, Apurva points out that we often overlook another crucial part of this conversation, which is the state.
What role does the state play? How can the state determine these cases? And why are we having so many of these cases? And these are larger questions. We are so used to this vocabulary of calling someone an urban Naxal. That could be from your government functionaries, the prime minister as well. We recently saw the RSS chief, for example, refer to someone as urban Naxals. So the phraseology and the intention with which this is used is all very political and we know what it means. But is that enough to cost someone their life and liberty? These are the larger questions. But I think what really stands out in Sai Baba's case is not just the usual failing of the judiciary that we are used to, but in this case, the judiciary actively took retrograde steps in very, very unprecedented ways. The fact that the state challenged an acquittal by the High Court the same day, even before the orders had been put out, and the Supreme Court constituted an extraordinary bench which had a sitting on a Saturday, it wasn't a working day, and stayed the acquittal.
She says the Supreme Court should have been more circumspect, to say the least. In fact, what's really surprising are the details of how that Saturday bench was constituted.
Justice UU Lalit, who was the Chief Justice at that time, had constituted that bench. In his post-retirement interviews, he actually told journalist Srinivasan Jain, who was with NDTV at that time, how he came about to constitute that particular bench. And both these judges on that bench, Justices M.R. Shah and Bela Trivedi, were generally the sort of judges who we know give the benefit of doubt to the state in such cases. And the explanation was sort of even more bizarre than what actually happened. That the bench was constituted so casually. The judge just looked around and asked, "Are you free on Saturday?" And 2 judges apparently were free and volunteered, and that bench was set up. The enormity of this life or death question, we keep saying that word, so maybe we've lost the import of it. But this life or death question was determined in such a casual way, and the Supreme Court stayed it. The only saving grace, I would say, is a second acquittal when it happened. The Supreme Court did not interfere. But it took Sai Baba 2 acquittals to be out of prison. But again, here, when he wanted parole, his mother had passed away. The state did not show any lenience, So these are all failings that I am sure happen in many, many, many other cases. But since we are talking about this case, it's just very sad.
And Apurva, he was someone who had 90% disability. He is not someone who would have been considered a flight risk. And yet he was kept in an anda cell, he was denied parole. What sort of checks and balances are there in the system that allow such a thing to happen?
I'm not sure there are any, Shashank, because Sai Baba got bail on medical grounds, but then in that meantime, his conviction came through. So, you only get bail as an under trial, not as a convict. Once you're a convict, you spend time in prison and you get parole, which of course he was denied. But what is it that needs the state to put a person who is 90% disabled in that anda cell in Nagpur? I have no answer. What is the checks and balances? That's, of course, the judiciary. That's the last resort. But when the state itself has decided to act in a particular manner, and I don't just mean Sai Baba, right? There are several people, and we do talk about the state of our criminal justice system, all of these larger questions. But I'm not sure we have any checks and balances apart from going to court and hoping for your day in court.
And for things to change or improve in that sense, would it require, for example, amending the UAPA or even making changes to limit the state's control over these matters?
No, definitely the state has power to make certain legislation. In fact, make very stringent legislation to curb terror in India. And it is in that line that the UAPA was enacted. Yes, all of that is true. But because it is such a serious piece of legislation, which can virtually alter the life of someone who is an accused, we should hold the state to a higher standard of accountability. It cannot be callous. Let's say the state has not been able to bring credible evidence to the table in court. The state should be penalized for it. Because in UAPA, let's remember, even statutorily, the state is mandated to do its homework before coming to court, which is why there's a process of sanction. That when a competent authority is granting sanction, you see whether there's a prima facie case. And that cannot be the whims of the state, right? That cannot be stemming from mere prejudice. And after a sanction has been granted, when the case eventually comes to court, charges are framed, which means a court has also determined that there are prima facie evidence, right? And then if the state is unable to bring any credible evidence, forget whether the court accepts that evidence or not. There could always be a situation when the state brings very credible evidence, but the other side has argued its way out of it, has convinced the court that that evidence is to be doubted. But in the absence of any credible evidence, the state, yes, should face some consequences.
You were listening to Three Things by The Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.